So we've walked about 15 minutes across the city, we've walked through the sports stadium, and then we've entered this park of the surrounding area of the castle, which is a really dramatic change in the feel of the city. Can you tell us a bit about what the structure we're standing in front of?
Well, Hiroshima Castle has a long history, going back centuries and centuries, because Hiroshima was a military base. It's always had a martial history. This construction is actually completely rebuilt in the 1950s from scratch, because the original site was pretty much annihilated by the bomb. So it is a very interesting site to look at in comparison and connected with where we've just been.
Why? In what way? In what way?
Well, for many reasons. It was originally rebuilt in 1951 when, as part of the reconstruction process for Hiroshima,
as a temporary mock-up?
As a temporary structure, as part of an athletics get-together,
right.
Some kind of athletics, and it was literally part of an amusement park that was built on these grounds. The temporary structure went up, and the people of Hiroshima felt a great kind of delight to see something from the old Hiroshima back. Yeah. And then there began this movement to actually reconstruct this castle
on a permanent basis
from scratch. We actually just looked inside the museum at a photograph literally showing a roller coaster that seems to actually have run through that temporary structure in 1951.
And it's odd in that obviously it's a timber structure from the outside, but when you go inside, there's a lot of it's steel, it's concrete, it's a thoroughly modern.
You know a little bit more than I do about Japanese attitudes to reconstruction and preservation.
Well,
I was noticing outside what I thought were wooden pillars, and they're actually beautifully produced concrete imitations of trunks, of tree trunks.
Well, this speaks to an interesting, actually in 2015-16 time, because of the destruction of sites in Syria and Iraq and Palmyra most notably. What we're seeing is a new debate around replicas and the value of replicas and whether it's legitimate, particularly in the digital age, to be rebuilding structures. So this is a robust replica of a structure as it looked from the outside, but internally it's reinforced with modern materials. But that, again, as you say, that's sort of also not in the use of modern materials, but the reproduction and the reconstruction of structures is much more aligned with the Japanese conservation of philosophy than a Western approach.
Right.
So the Japanese approach, because of so many of the timber structures and they decay in the climate and through the organic matter that gets eaten, then the knowledge, the preservation ethos is about preserving knowledge, how to build and how to rebuild. So that's what you're preserving on a generational basis. So to reconstruct rather than the fabric itself. So you're not preserving the 2,000-year-old bit of stone, you're preserving the knowledge how to maintain and rebuild that.
Now one of the reasons this is such an interesting space is because there's a lot of contention about how it being effectively symbolic of Japan's aggression in East Asia and Southeast Asia. It was the military, the reason it was annihilated as well as for practical strategic reasons, also the symbolic heart, in a way, of Imperial military Japan. It was the center of headquarters during the First Sino-Japanese War. The Imperial General Headquarters moved here. In a sense, if you were in Hiroshima in those days, there was probably a certain degree of civic pride about this being this
but also
military base.
More than symbolic, there's a lot of military armaments stored here and on the compound itself.
So when the decision comes and when the sort of people are so enthused by this temporary structure that goes up in 1951 and then is destroyed by a typhoon, and there starts to be a move amongst certain centre-right politicians in the municipal administration to push for this. There's of course a reaction of that this is supposed to be a peace city, a monument to eternal peace. What are we doing?
Restoring a military structure.
There's actually a committee that considers this some point before 58, and the chair of the committee says the historical value of this site is the fact it was annihilated, destroyed. So it's very interesting. It comes back to this question we've been pondering as we're here. What is it actually like to live with almost in some ways the oppressive internationalizing of your city's memoryscape?
Well, and also
as a sign of atomic peace and the peace movement, etc., etc.
And also that responsibility that the city feels of never to forget, and therefore that's passed on through generations. And so the school children will have this in their everyday schooling, and as you grow up in a city, this is a history that obviously that's ever present for you. So this represents a whole different era and continuity with that past that predates any of that. And therefore to also see that as a form of nostalgia, which is a kind of that's often used in Western academia as a form of critique.
Yes.
It's also, I think, a city like this raises that question of, I think a much more way that you need to be much more careful around offering that critique because of the desire to retain continuity. And if you erase some of the histories, some of the usages of this structure through that military Meiji period and up through to World War II, then this obviously the ways in which this is being presented today as a museum as well, it kind of erases a lot of that historical period and goes back to the pre-modern samurai and Edo period of its construction and so on and so forth. And so, how do we read that?
Yeah, well, the critique is that it builds on this attempt in Japanese nationalist historiography to treat the expansion, the sort of period of aggression of the militarists as an aberration, and to somehow sidestep in a way August 6, 1945, and all the factors behind that, and to create this continuity of an early Hiroshima and then a new Hiroshima, and to move away from that and to enshrine that narrative. And I think there's a danger in simply seeing this as nostalgia. I do wonder. I was very struck reading about when the baseball ground went up, how delighted people were. In the old pictures, you see that almost looming over the A-dome. People were to have some sort of site that was perhaps
to attach themselves to again.
Perhaps not the Peace Memorial.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And in a similar way, this site, the sort of emotions now, is that just nostalgia?
No,
or is that actually about civic identity
and continuity
and not having your identity entirely appropriated by an international, becoming a symbol of international peace?
Absolutely. Because also it's important to recall as well that the population of the city around the time of the atomic bomb was around 350,000 or between 300 and 400,000. And so the number of people who did die was not the entire city. There were a number of people that did stay within the city. And then
I mean, when I grew up, you wouldn't have understood those kind of realities.
Exactly.
I mean, because it was annihilation, and you saw the whole thing was annihilation.
Obliteration.
And all these complexities emerge when you're actually on site. I do think that coming back to the place it sort of the role it plays in a modern urban identity or a civic identity or civic pride in terms of Hiroshima is very interesting, because they're in a double bind here. We just went through the museum and I was struck by the fact there's very, very little on the period 1894-95 through to 1945. There's very little as the imperial headquarters. There's one signboard talking about, in fact, how a lot of the site was burnt down and removed so that they could have military facilities. Now, one might read that and say, here again, we're escaping denial, etc., etc. But then part of the pressure to do that is because this is a peace city.
Right. I mean, this was a structure neither of us really knew about before we came here.
Absolutely.
And so it's been written out of the story of the reconstruction of the city internationally.
I mean, this is purely one day in a site, but we haven't seen any other non-Japanese tourists in this site. And this is actually a site of native place tourism. It's about local crafts, it's about local Hiroshima history. It's really the history of Hiroshima city going back. A large part of that is also the samurai culture. So ironically, in a way, there is that martial element still there.
And also, it offers an interesting vista of the city. At the top, you can see there's a caged area which you can actually walk around. And you get a real sense of the city's, how it sits within its landscape, but also the high-rises that are around here, and a really extraordinary reconstruction that would have happened. And that's quite interesting.
Well, we are trying to work out if anyone has actually studied that reconstruction and really
urban geographers
has really looked at this city in that context. I'm not aware of it, but we'll go and dig around and see.